Hi, my name is Ken Taves. For my teaching demonstration, I will be explaining the basics of an internal combustion engine in a 4-stroke setup. Engines are at their most basic, nothing more than very complicated air pumps. They just move air in and out. That's really all they do. How they do it is considerably more complicated. We start with the intake, where an engine will suck air in, and then compression, where the air that's just sucked in and fuel will be compressed and squeezed. In the compression process, it makes the air very hot, which is good. It makes the fuel that's been pulled in with the intake air, the intake charge, atomize and equally distribute throughout the air as it's compressed. Combustion, spark plug, makes it go bang. That's what gives you all the power, so that comes from. The exhaust is where the cylinder comes back up and pushes all the exhaust and gases and air after it's been burned out of the engine. On this cutaway, it's very easy to see. The air comes in on this side, it comes out this side. As the piston comes down, it sucks air in all the way down. Intake valve closes. Well, all the valves will be closed, but the valves will close and pistons will come back up, compressing the air and the fuel, and the ignition spark plug will fire when it's just about at the very top. That forces the pistons back down. That's where the torque comes from that helps the vehicle move. Once that happens, the exhaust side valves will open up, the pistons will come back up and pushes all that air back out. Fairly straightforward. Really, it's quite simple. Everything that goes into it is the complex part. At the very basic, you have a crank. This is what ties most of the engine together. The rotating assembly involves the crank, the rods, and the pistons. And very often, they're forgotten, but they're also very important, are the piston rings. There's usually 3 rings. There's a big one to help it slide. There's another one to keep everything in the combustion chamber in the combustion chamber. And then on the bottom, there's a big oil ring. And that's what allows the oil that's on the cylinder walls to go back down. It helps the piston move up and down very quickly without creating a whole lot of friction. Friction will create wear, and without that, we wouldn't get very far. So with the rotating assembly, it's very balanced. This is a 4-cylinder. You can see how 2 pistons on each side, they come up together. These 2 pistons move together as well. As they come up, one piston will be pushing exhaust out, the other piston will be getting ready to fire, and back and forth. Same is true on this side. This is what keeps it balanced. 4-cylinder engines have a very hard time staying balanced. As you can see down here, these are counterbalance weights that are on the crankshaft itself, and that's what helps it run smooth. And that is, for the most part, what's on the bottom end of an internal combustion engine. And pretty much any engine with cylinders, whether it's 2, 4, 6, 8, or more, it's all the same. What regulates everything is in the head. In the head, we have camshafts. The camshafts are just steel rods with little smooth lobes that stay oiled. And then underneath, there's, let's see, I'm not sure you can see it from there, but there's lifters, and the lobes push the lifters down. The lifters are actually hydraulic lifters. It's also flat tapping, doesn't need adjustment. But the lifters have oil in them that passes through them, and the oil creates a small cushion as it pushes the valves down. Without that, it would be very noisy, it would run very rough, and it would be very hard to keep it in time, precisely. So the cam pushes the lifter down, the lifter pushes the valve open and lets it close. There's a lot of different styles of intake heads and cam timing. Variable valve timing is where on this engine, off of I believe a Prius, there is a module on this side that is controlled by a solenoid, which can adjust slightly back and forth to allow the exhaust valves to open at slightly different times. It's not a lot, but it's enough to create a little bit of extra torque and a little more efficiency. What ties this to the engine is on this side, there's a timing chain that goes all the way down around the bottom of the crank. Some engines have belts. I think for the most part, automotive manufacturers are getting away from belts and sticking more to timing chains. Most diesels have gears, just a set gears that do not have any kind of valve timing. And that is the intake and exhaust components for the head themselves. The head also includes the more important parts of the fuel system. The fuel system obviously includes the tank where you put fuel in. Fuel gets sucked out of the tank by a pump, it goes through a filter, on its way up to the engine. Most modern cars have a high pressure fuel pump, which brings the fuel from about 40 to 60 PSI to much, much higher. The more refined European diesels, they have pressure staying almost 60,000 PSI. Most direct injection engines, they're about, well, anywhere between 1,500 to about 2,500 PSI. And the direct injection is usually directly right on top of the head, goes through the head into the combustion chamber itself, and squirts fuel directly into the combustion chamber. It's very efficient. It's very easy, but you need higher fuel pressure because you have to overcome the you have to overcome the compression as the cylinder is coming up. It usually squirts right about there, where it's not quite all the way to the top, but squirts there, and just real fast. It closes, finishes coming up, and then fires. There's different types of fuel systems. There's radial injection, there's throttle body injection, and there's carburation. They all have their pluses and minuses. Some are better than others. Most of the world is doing either direct port injection, direct injection, or multi-port injection. We've pretty much moved away from everything else. They're the most reliable, most easy to tune, but they're also more expensive to make. But in a world where everybody wants bigger cars and everybody wants better gas mileage and more power, sacrifices have to be made. After the intake and the fuel is controlled by the ECU or ECM, depending on your manufacturer. The ECU or ECM also controls the timing. The timing is a big part of how an engine runs and how it runs at different RPMs, different elevations. Sucking in the same air or the same amount of air at sea level, it has a lot more oxygen than it does at higher altitudes. And having a electronic fuel injection system and electronic controlled timing system can allow your car to run very well at any altitude, which is amazing. And it's impressive how far we've come in the last few years. The timing system is controlled by the same unit, the engine control unit, that controls the fuel. So they kind of work hand in hand. The power comes from the ECM or ECU, engine control unit, and it goes to a timing module. They're called different things depending on the manufacturer. And the timing module is what sends electronic pulses to the coils. Coils are little chambers filled with usually oil or a very tightly wound copper winding that holds enough electricity and sends it to the spark plug all at once, which gives it a very hot, very bright, fast spark, and is enough to combust under pressure. The more pressure, the harder it is for a spark plug to ignite the fuel. And as a lot of manufacturers are going towards higher compression for more efficiency, we need hotter and hotter spark. And that's why we've gone away from having one coil, one big coil for however many cylinders you have, to each individual cylinder having its own coil pack. And most manufacturers at this point are having coil packs that drop in directly on top of the spark plug, connect to the spark plug, allowing it to be very easy to work on, very easy to maintain, and troubleshoot, which is great for us because it's as simple as finding out which one's not working and replacing it, instead of diagnosing and spending time figuring out why it's not hot enough, why it's not burning, why we're having misses, because if all the spark plugs are getting fire or electricity, why aren't they igniting? Well, there's a lot of variables in that kind of system. But with the coil directly on top of the spark plug, you're getting the same consistent amount of heat to the spark plug every time. Very easy, very straightforward. Let's see, the cooling system. The cooling system is very important, often overlooked. It allows your engine to run at the optimum temperature for combustion, and keeps it from overheating, which is very critical. There's usually a water pump that's either ran by the timing belt or timing chain, and it's usually near the crank in front of the engine, and that forces coolant through the block, comes out of the block, and then goes to a radiator. It also goes to the heater, which keeps you nice and warm in the winter. It's all comes right off your engine. Let's see. After that, we have the exhaust. Exhaust can vary vastly in design and platform and what it's used for. Some vehicles have turbochargers, which is basically a supercharger. It's another air pump that's powered by the exhaust and forces air into the engine. There are applications where turbochargers are used to boost efficiency. Most of the time, it's to get more power out of a small, more compact, more lightweight unit, and still be able to meet the goals set out to achieve by the engineering department. A lot of times, bigger engines they're too big or too heavy to fit in a specific platform, so they add turbochargers. Most cars or trucks have exhaust manifolds. This one has a nice little tube manifold. Let's see if I can bring this over here. It's not the most efficient design, as the tubes are different lengths. However, it's very, very neat, very compact, very cheap, efficient to make, and it's all right there. There's one piece. You don't have to worry about anything. Big, nice flange, and it's good. After this, it goes through a catalytic converter, which burns off all the bad ozone destroying chemicals. Sometimes there will be a portion of the exhaust gases that will get taken out of the exhaust before it goes to the catalytic converter and routed back to the intake. And that usually only happens at idle or cruising speeds where you're not trying to make as much power as possible. After that, it goes through the cat, and then it goes through the rest of the exhaust, out the muffler, and that is pretty much the extent of it. There's a lot more intricate details of an engine, and there's thousands of different engines, and they're all different in their own good and bad ways. This one in particular is a hybrid, which is very convenient, not only for emissions. Most people focus on emissions when they think of hybrid, but also good for performance and efficiency, really. It uses the torque from the electric engines to move the vehicle as well, instead of all of the torque being dependent on the engine. So that way, you can use less fuel, have a smaller engine, it's less weight, and it uses less fuel. So it's really very good. It makes it make for a very comfortable driving experience for the user, because they make no noise. There's instant torque, and it's always ready to go, assuming there's electricity. Hybrids have come a long way. Electric vehicles have also come a long way, as well as plug-in hybrids, which is kind of the best of both worlds. Kind of the two combined. Again, excuse me. Having both of those systems, it's more money. It's more expensive, but you get what you pay for. And it's ultimately meeting the demands of the market is the most important thing for manufacturers to achieve, while still producing a quality product. So, that said, the intake system on these cars has a very interesting effect on all of the systems that I have talked about already. Now, some cars will have turbochargers that forces air into the car, adds a whole nother complex system because it has to be cooled. Anytime you compress air, it gets hot. So then you'd have to run it through an intercooler to keep the intake charge at a low enough temperature. Otherwise, if you're running hot air into the cylinder, where it's then compressed again, that air can get so hot that the fuel will combust before the piston has reached the top, and it will detonate, and it will basically force the piston down. No, I'm on our side. It will force the piston down before the crank is moved to the position where it can be pushed down. So it's over here. It's called pre-detonation. All the other cylinders are moving together in the same direction. It's a lot of mass. If it pushes it down at the wrong time, you'll usually break a rod, and it will, it's got to go somewhere, go through the block, break the crank. A lot of bad things can happen from that. As well as that, longer intake runners, they can be very long, depending on the application, and they can smooth out the air before it gets sucked into the engine. Some cars use throttle bodies to control the air. Carbureted engines, they have essentially what is the butterfly from a throttle body built in to the carburetor itself. Carburetors can be very efficient in that sense because instead of just having a normal throttle body with a butterfly that opens and closes, it uses a Venturi effect, which also sucks in the fuel. On a carburetor, the air comes in from the top, gets tighter and tighter, and then expands on both sides. So as the air gets squeezed in, it expands to a larger, much larger, make that a little bit clearer. So if this was your intake, it would get compressed ever so slightly, and the bottom, it would get pulled out. And as it expands, it cools down. Some of the older carburetors from the 60s, even up into the 70s, they would actually have an issue with these, where the air would get so cold as it came through the carburetor, it would freeze and create all sorts of issues. Because cold air is good. Frozen air is the opposite, really, because once you hit the fuel, which is there's usually different ports depending on the carburetor. Some carburetors squirt the air through a little orifice, ran from the side. It squirts it down. Boom. Squirts the fuel right down. So as the air compresses and then expands, it atomizes the fuel. If the air is too cold and too dense, the fuel will not atomize, and it will collect on the bottom of the intake manifold. And that can be an issue as well. But once a carburetor is warmed up, there are little ports in the side, and then there's a chamber which holds fuel. And it's not under pressure, it's just sitting there. And as the air flows past the holes, it will suck fuel out of the chambers. That's actually called the Bernoulli principle. And it sucks fuel out of the chamber using the vacuum that's created by the air flowing by. And then you have almost perfect atomization. Now that's only possible if your air-fuel ratio is almost perfect, which is very, very difficult to do for a carburetor, which is again why we've moved to fuel injection. With that said, I think I've covered about everything. Again, my name is Ken Tapes, and I thank you for your time.